Let's discuss provisioning relational data services. What is provisioning? Essentially, we're just running a series of tasks for creating resources. So Azure would create our resources or configure a service. So they do the provisioning for us. It's usually behind the scenes, right? So as an end user, you don't have to worry about the provisioning. You just specify the horsepower and some other configuration. One example of this could be a SQL database, right? We set up the SQL database. It'll set up various resources for us, such as the disks we need, the memory we need, and the CPUs that we will avail of. How a service provider provisions the resources is so much behind the scenes that we don't really see it, and we shouldn't really need to be too concerned about how the process works. All we need to do from a consumer standpoint is specify the parameters that determine the size of our resources required. So how much disk space, for instance, that you plan on using. So if you've got a SQL database, how much disk space do you have provisioned for that database to use? Memory is another. You want to provision the amount of memory for your workload. Computing power, or CPU. How much computing power in terms of vCPUs do we want to assign to any of our resources? And finally, network bandwidth. So if we have a heavy bandwidth application, we may need to provision a higher network bandwidth. We can provision these high and low depending on the needs of our application. So how do we provision in Azure? What are the provisioning services they offer? Many different services they use. One is the portal. The portal gives you that graphical user interface where you can log in. You can do it all through the web browser, and you can control all your Azure resources and services right from your web browser. You also have the option of the Azure command line interface. So that gives you a set of commands that you can run to the Azure portal, right? It's available for Windows, Mac, and Linux environments. They also offer the Azure PowerShell. So PowerShell being a cross-platform task automation and configuration management framework, we can now interact with the Azure portal using Azure PowerShell for Windows. And finally, ARM templates. What are ARM templates? Right, so any move to the cloud, we're probably going to do a lot of repetition. So by using templates, Azure Resource Manager templates, we can create configuration as code, and we can provision our services much more quicker and much more automatic using templates. Let's discuss the Azure portal. The Azure portal is web-based, so it should work in your browser. You can manage your subscriptions using a GUI. You can manage your services. You can set up custom dashboards to view insight on your services and your resources, right? So it's good for visualization of all the metrics that your services may be giving to the monitoring software, things that you can't see so easily in the command line. The Azure command line interface is available for Windows, Mac OS, and Linux, and it supports Docker and Azure Cloud Shell. So we can start pushing out Docker images and Azure Cloud Shell images using our Azure command line interface. We don't have to go into the portal. This can be quicker if you're really into developing or if you have a lot of experience using command line tools. It gives you command line flexibility, so we can copy and paste commands, we can use our up and down arrows to quickly get to commands, and we can really just view the information that we want to see without having to see all the other clutter around it. And finally, you can configure things in the command line just as you can in the portal. So if you want to turn off settings for firewalls on your RDS, if you want to configure more horsepower for your databases, these are all configurable as well. And finally, Resource Manager deployment templates. We can use Resource Manager, we can deploy templates using the command line to speed up our automation of provisioning and configuration of our resources. Azure PowerShell. So what is PowerShell? PowerShell is a cross-platform task automation and configuration management network. It has command line shell and scripting language abilities. And unlike most shells, they return and accept text. It's great for configuration management, and it runs using the .NET Common Language Runtime. So we can do our configuration management with our Azure resources in Azure PowerShell. Azure Resource Manager, or ARM, templates. What are these ARM templates? So when we move to the cloud, we have a lot of development methods, agile development methods, right? Teams iterate quickly. And a lot of times we repeatedly deploy the same infrastructure and same solutions to the cloud. So being said, we can use some form of code and infrastructure as a code to allow us to upload our templates and provision our resources just from a text template. These text templates have a JavaScript object notation, or a JSON file, which defines the infrastructure and the configuration. And again, this is repeatedly referred to as infrastructure as code because it automates our deployments. These scripts do have a declarative syntax, so it states the intent to deploy the resources that we specify in our templates. In this video, I'm going to demonstrate how to provision a Microsoft Azure SQL database. So once we are in our Azure portal, we can come over to Services and we can find SQL Databases. This is one of the many managed databases provided using Microsoft Azure. So we can go ahead and click SQL Databases, and it'll bring us into our console area. So if we had databases already, we'd see them here. We'd see their status, what type of server it was running on, the server name. There's any subscriptions that you had would be all here. So since we don't have any and we're actually provisioning, we're going to go ahead and click Create SQL Database. So once I click it, it'll bring me to a screen where I can provision my first database. We've got 5 tabs to go through to provision this database. So first they ask you for a subscription. We're under the free trial. If we had any other subscriptions that weren't free trial or some corporate subscriptions, we'd see these under the drop down as well. And then we have a resource group. So resource group is a group of resources that share the same permissions and lifecycle policies. We don't have one, so we're going to have to go ahead and click Create New to create one. And we're going to call it Databases. And click OK. So that's our resource group. So any new databases that we provision, and if we want to have the same lifecycle, same permissions, we put it in that resource group. So we come down to database details. We can type in a database name. So for our database name, I can call it Demo Database. And now I have to select the server. So what server do I want to put it on? Again, like resource groups, I don't have any servers created. So I got to click Create New. I click Create New. A little pop-up over to the right-hand side. So this server name needs to be unique, globally unique. So I can't put in something like database because it's already in use. Okay? So I could put in Skillsoft database. That's available. Enter my admin login. So I'm going to put in my name. And I'm going to put in my password. As you can see, I meet all the password requirements. And confirm my password. Then pick my region. So US East, US East 2. Okay, I'll go with US East. Click OK. Our server has been created, and now the database has been assigned to that server. They also give us the option of using a SQL Elastic pool. So we can pool resources for all the databases that are on this server. So that would be compute, eDTUs, and storage resources. That would be shared amongst all the databases that the SQL Elastic pool contains. We only have one database right now, so we don't need that option. It's a way of sharing resources amongst all the databases in that pool, right? So it makes for a little bit easier management. Our compute and storage is a standard, right? We get 10 DTUs and 250 gigabytes of storage. So we'll leave that as it is right now. Next, we have to click networking to configure our networking. Do we want no access? Do we want a public endpoint? Right, so do we want this database available from the public? And if so, set your firewall rules. So should Azure services and resources be able to access this server? And do we want to add a current client IP address? If we want to take a private endpoint, they would be here. We'd already have to have some private endpoints created, and we can associate it with that private IP address. For now, I'm going to click No Access, and we can configure that connection method later. So I come down and click Additional Settings. Now they're asking me, do you want to start with a blank database? Do you want to restore from a backup? Or do I want to select some sample data? So that would be great for testing. Right now, I'm going to say, give me some sample data. If I chose none, it would just create an empty database. And if I chose backup, it asks me for my most recent backup that I want to restore from. Any database correlation rules are here. And you also have Azure Defender for SQL, right? So threat protection. Right now it's a 30-day free trial, then it's about $20 Canadian a month. So I'm going to leave it as not now. Come into tags, and again, tags are just key value pairs that allow us to kind of keep track of our resources or consolidate them for billing purposes. So I could say created by and put a value of Richard in. So now I click Review and Create. I make a look at it and see it gives me my estimated cost per month. Shows me my subscription is the free trial. Shows me all the stuff that we set up in previous windows. My networking components. Everything looks good. I can download a template for automation, right? So I don't have to use the console anymore. It makes it quick to spin up SQL databases just like this. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and click Create. You can see the initializing and the deployment, and now the deployment is in progress. So we should see all of the deployment here as things progress through. So it has accepted the resource that I want to create. And you can see that it has been created. If we come over, you can see our inputs. We can see our output. So what was output? We had no outputs created, but it could be things like connection strings. And then we have our template that it was created from. So I come back to overview. You'll see now that it is still in progress. If we come down and click the resource, right, Skillsoft database resource, it brings us into the SQL Server database that we just provisioned. Okay, so it shows us our resource groups, our location. We can manage our backups. We can configure DTU quotas. Okay, once everything is completed, you get a pop-up to say deployment has succeeded. If you click Go to Resource, again, it brings you back to this same page where you can, and we will, perform more configuration options on your newly provisioned SQL database in Microsoft Azure. So I hope this video showed you how to get started provisioning this SQL database, getting it up and running, getting some sample data in, and start playing around with some of the powerful things that you can do with this managed SQL database service. In this video, I'm going to demonstrate how to provision an Azure database for PostgreSQL. So once we're in the Azure console, we can find the Azure database for PostgreSQL servers. We can click Create. We can click View. You see our free training options. I'm going to click and go into the console. So if I had any previous Postgres database servers here, then they would show up, but I don't. So I need to come down and click Create Azure Database. So once I click it, we're presented with 4 options. So you got a single server options, right? That's for broad range transactional workloads, right? It's enterprise ready and it's fully managed up to 64 vCores, right? Text search, a lot of really good options for you to integrate. You also have a flexible server. So if you want a little more customization and you want a little bit more control, right, as a developer, this would be the option you choose, right? You control the maintenance. You control zone redundancy, cost optimization. Right now it's only in preview mode. You also have the hyperscale server group, ultra high performance, data needs beyond 100 gigabytes. Right, so if you're running some multi-tenant applications, real-time analytic workloads, they need massive sub-second response, right, and little latency. That's where you want your hyperscale server group. And then you've got the Azure Arc-enabled PostgreSQL hyperscale. Best for high performance and data needs beyond 100 gigabytes on your infrastructure. All right, so basically we deployed on the infrastructure. It could be on premises, could be in the edge, could be in a multi-cloud, right? And again, much like the hyperscale, it's good for multi-tenant applications. But again, it's for data needs beyond 100 gigabytes. For us, we're going to run a single server for now. So I'm going to go ahead and click Create. And where it's a managed service, it's a lot less to choose from now. It's a lot less to configure. So we've got basic settings, additional settings, tags, and then create. So our subscription is here. We're on the free trial. If we had other subscriptions, they would be here as well. So a resource group is a group of resources that share the same life cycle, same policies, same permissions. And so I can click Create New, and we can call it PostgreSQL. Right? And we can group all of our PostgreSQL databases into this resource group. That way we can treat them all the same with lifecycle policies, permissions, and it's easier organization. So now we need to enter some server details. Enter a server name. We'll say demo PostgreSQL. It needs to be globally unique. This one is. We choose our data source. Do we want to start with a blank? Do we want to start with a backup? And if we start with a backup, we have to have a backup ready. We'll start with a blank data source. Our location is in US East. We want version 11. We could go down to 10, 9.6, or 9.5. Our compute and storage is here. It's general purpose. It's 4 virtual cores and 100 gigabytes of storage. We'll leave that as is for now. And then we just put in our admin username and password. So once we're all happy and the console is all happy, we can click Next for additional settings. So do we want to have encryption? Right? It's encrypted by default with managed keys. Infrastructure double encryption is an additional infrastructure encryption layer by using a secondary service managed key. If you turn it on, it can slow down the database a little, right? I'm good with just the basic default encryption. I'm going to click Next, assign a tag created by Richard. Go down, click Next, Review and Create, and it gives us all the information. It gives us our estimated cost per month, and it shows us that we're on the free trial. It shows us our backup retention of 7 days. The redundancy for our backups are locally redundant. We can change these things. So again, I can download a template for automation to make quicker deployments down the road, or I can go ahead and click Create. So I'm going to go ahead and click Create. You'll see the deployment process is there. You see the overview, and as things happen, we'll start seeing them pop up under this real-time log. You can also see your inputs that you put in, any outputs if you had any outputs in the template, and then the template itself. So if we come back to overview, you can see it has accepted our job, and in just a few minutes it should be configured and ready for us to dig in and start configuring. We can go ahead and download our deployment details if we want into a zip folder, which would be good if you're using any type of repository or any deployment software that's necessary, because you may need to take that full package and check it in somewhere. And so you can download that there. Once it's succeeded, you'll see the pop-up window, tells you the deployment succeeded. You can click Go to Resource, and now you're right into your PostgreSQL database console. I hope this video gave you some insight on how to create your first Azure database for PostgreSQL Server. And if you're looking to migrate to the cloud and PostgreSQL Server is your database of choice, well, I really hope you got something out of it that can really help you down the road when that migration time comes. In this video, I'm going to demonstrate how to provision a MySQL database in Microsoft Azure. So once we're in our console, the quickest way to find the MySQL is just to come up under the search bar and type in MySQL. You'll see two services. We see the Azure database for MySQL servers and Azure database for MySQL flexible servers. We're going to go ahead and click Azure database for MySQL servers. We're brought to the MySQL console. As you can see, we currently have no databases. If we did, it would be displayed here. So what we want to do is create an Azure database for MySQL server. So let's go ahead and click. And that brings us into our configuration and provisioning. So how do we plan to use the service? Do we want a single server, right, for just a broad range of transactions? Or do we want a flexible server? Do we want to allow the developer to have a lot more control over the server, do custom maintenance windows, etc.? So it's less managed with a flexible server, more managed with a single server. I'm going to go ahead and click Create on the single server. And now it brings us into our provisioning screen. So we have a subscription. We're on the free trial. Any other subscriptions would be here. Resource group. If I want to create a resource group for all MySQL servers, right? I want all those SQL servers to share the same lifecycle policies and permissions. I'll create a resource group and call it MySQL Databases. That way, every MySQL database I create, I can assign to that resource group, and they share the same lifecycle, same permissions, and these type of things. So now I have to set up a server name. So I can say demo MySQL database. Again, it must be available globally, and this one is. Our data source. Are we going to start with no data source, an empty database, or are we going to go ahead with a backup? If we choose a backup, we have to have one available to us, which we currently don't because we're starting from scratch. So I'm going to go ahead and say no. We set up a login, so I can say R. Spencer and give it a password. Confirm the password. Right, and our compute and storage is going to be a general purpose, 4 virtual cores and 100 gigabytes of storage. So I click next. Do we want double encryption? Right, it's encrypted by default, but infrastructure double encryption is an additional infrastructure encryption layer. I got a secondary key. It can have some impact on your performance. I'm going to leave it off. I'm going to look at tags. I'm going to create a tag just to say who created this resource. Next, we review. We look at our database. Gives us our estimated monthly cost. All the settings that we set up are here. I can download a template for future use and make it quicker and easier to provision these type of databases. And I can go ahead and click Create. You'll see the initializing deployment, submitting the deployment, and now the deployment is in progress. It will accept our job, and then as things finish up, we'll see them come up under the deployment details. And we'll also get like a little green screen up on the right-hand corner saying it's been completed. Another thing is you can download the deployment details in a zip file. Maybe if you need to check it in for some revision history or some deployment application and process you're using, you can download these deployment details and then check it in to whatever software you're using. So you'll know that the deployment went successfully and what had actually incurred and was created in that deployment. So once this gets created, which may take a reasonable amount of time, not too long because we're only using 4 vCPUs, so it shouldn't be a totally long process. And once it's provisioned, then we can go ahead and get in, fine tweak it, do some configuration, add some data, and then start to use it. Once it's successful, you can see it says deployment succeeded. You can click go to resource, and then you're brought into your MySQL database. From here, you can do some fine-tuning again and some extra configuration. But I hope this video showed you how to provision your first MySQL database in Microsoft Azure. So get in, create one, start playing around, load in some data, and really get your hands dirty with the MySQL database in Microsoft Azure. In this video, I'm going to demonstrate how to provision a Maria database in Microsoft Azure. So once you're in your Azure portal, come up to the search bar. I find it's the easiest way to find a lot of the products, and just type in Maria. You'll see Azure database for MariaDB servers. Go ahead and click that link, come into the MariaDB servers console. Once we're here, we don't have any existing databases, so we'll go ahead and click Create Azure Database for MariaDB Server. Once we click it, we're brought into the provisioning screen. So here's where we set up our provisioning. Under subscription would be what subscription do we want to tie this to. I'm on the free trial. If I had any other ones here, you would see them listed. And a resource group allows us to group all of our resources together that you want to share the same life cycle and permissions. Right, so I have MySQL database resource groups. I have Postgres database resource groups. I'm going to create a new one and call it MariaDB. That way I can group all my MariaDB databases together. So now we go down to server detail. I'm going to call it Demo Richard MariaDB. Again, it must be globally available, and it is. My data source. Do I want to restore from a previous backup? If so, I'd have to find one and select it. In this case, we're going to start with a blank database, so I select none. I pick my location, US East, US East 2, US West 2, depending on where I am or where I want to put the database. What version I want to use. Do I want to use 10.2 or 10.3? And then our compute and storage. So do we want general purpose 4 virtual cores, 100 gigabytes of storage? That's fine for our needs right now. Then we have to select the admin username. So I'll call it R. Spencer. I'll give it my password. And I'll confirm my password. They match. So I'll click next and I'll assign some tags. So these are key value pairs that you can do to track resources, track billing, like these type of things. So I'll create a tag called created by, and I'll give the value Richard. I go down and click next, review and create, and it gives me an overview of everything that I just set up. So it tells me the subscription, the resource group, my login, all that relevant information, and I can download a template for automation if I want to do this again in the future. I'm going to go ahead and click create. You'll see the pop-up in the top right-hand corner. Deployment is in progress. It'll accept the job, and then it will start to provision the database. It could take upwards of 4 to 5 minutes. Another interesting thing you can do is you can download the deployment details. So if you're using some repository where you need to check in changes and check in code, check in deployments, these type of things, and that's a great option for you to download those deployment details. So as you can see, the job has been accepted and it's still provisioning. So you can see that if you come up under notifications, now it's done. You get your pop-up, deployment has succeeded. You can click go to resource and you can see your new Maria database. So I hope this video showed you how to provision your database, give it the performance that you need, set it up in the appropriate location and its appropriate resource groups. So get in, create the database, provision it, and then play around and look around to see what you may need to configure to fine-tune that database for your specific application. In this video, I'm going to show you how to configure your SQL database that you've provisioned in Microsoft Azure. So 3 ways we can get there. We can click on SQL Databases to bring us to the console. It even gives us a drop down where we can click our most recent resources, which is also what we have here. Or we can click on our left-hand side and go to SQL Databases and click it. Then it brings us into our SQL Databases console. We can see the database that we already have created, and we can go ahead and click it to do some configuration. So you can see it pops up, right? So you want to collapse the left-hand side and just look at the console for this database. So here's where you can say if you want to change any of the earlier stuff that you set up when you provision, you can add elastic pools. We can change our subscription, right? We can go ahead and set our server firewall. We got to declare what minimum TLS version we want. Should it be a default connection? Can Azure resources access the server? And any of our firewall rules we can put in here. So once we go back, we can take a look at some of the other things we can do. So we've got an activity log, right? It shows what we've done. We've got any tags, right? We can diagnose and solve any problems here. These are most common problems, like a knowledge bank. And we can also connect it to the Power BI, Business Intelligence, Power Apps, and Power Automate platform. But what we really want to do is get into configuration. So we want to look at how can we size up our SQL server correctly. All right, so we need to size this server so we're not paying for more than we're using, but we need to have enough capacity to serve all of our requests. Okay, so first thing we need to know is, what is a DTU? All right, so DTU is a database transaction unit, and that's a blended measure of CPU, memory, and data input-output and transactional input-output. Right? It's in a ratio determined by an OLTP benchmark workload, and it's supposed to replicate a typical real-world workload. How can we kind of up our DTUs and down our DTUs? We've got multiple ways of looking at it. Now remember, since it's blended, once you up a DTU, you're upping your CPU power, your input outputs per second, and your latency. Right? So if I click what is a DTU, it brings me to the Azure page, and it kind of shows us what each package has. So the basic, standard, and premium. The CPU is just low for basic, low, medium, and high for standard, and just medium and high for premium. You can see the inputs and outputs per second increase very high once we get into the premium to 25 input outputs per second per DTU. So if we had 10 DTUs, we can have a possible 250 input outputs per second, and that would increase as we increase our DTUs. Latency is also faster with the premium, whereas basic and standard are 5 milliseconds and 10 milliseconds to read and write. So let's go back to the console, and here's where we can choose. Do we want basic? It gives us 5 DTUs. Standard gives us anywhere from 10 to 3,000, but on our free trial, we can only go higher than S1, so we got to come back. The best we can do is 20. We can also do 10. So if I bring it back down to 10, that's going to resize my database when I click apply. There are also some good DTU calculators that Microsoft gives to kind of estimate the proper service tier of your database. Right? It's accessed via PowerShell script. Another way is to look at your database utilization. Right? If you're maxing out your utilization, you may need to add more capacity, more DTUs. If you're not, and you're hovering around 10, 15%, maybe you can decrease those DTUs. So once you're happy with your DTUs, we can click apply. You'll see that we're going to change from 20 DTUs down to 10 DTUs. So it's going to scale the database automatically for us. Next, we can look at some geo-replication. Right? Maybe you want to create a secondary database in another region. Could be disaster recovery. Could be expanding your application to different areas. Right? So we can replicate it here. It tells us what our primary is. And we can come down and select any secondary. So I want to create a secondary database in US West. It's readable. I'd have to go ahead now and create another server in the database West region. Okay, so I'm going to say database West demo. I'm going to give it the same login and the same password. And I'm going to click select. Everything looks fine. I'm happy with how it looks. I click OK. And you'll see the deployment is in progress. I've got a secondary database in US West that is now initializing. So maybe I want to take some load off from the original database. Maybe I want to replicate for disaster recovery. Whatever the case may be, you can configure it here. We also have connection strings. So if you're connecting with .NET, JDBC, ODBC, PHP, and Go, you just click and you get your connection string for each framework that you're using. You can also sync to other databases. If we had another database or databases, you could create a sync group, a sync agent, and that would manage the synchronization between the databases. We've got some security configuration. We can come into our security center. We can enable Azure Defender. We can do a vulnerability assessment or an advanced threat protection. We can look at data encryption. Right now it's on. We could configure it to turn it off. And we can also do some data masking. And so we can create some rules to mask data, whether it's credit card numbers, social insurance numbers, whatever the case may be. You also get some monitoring. So we can configure some alarms based on metrics like CPU percentage or data space used or DTU used. Right? And these alarms will help us respond to issues in our database much quicker. So I hope this video showed you how to really get in and configure some of your database, like your DTUs, and getting your connection strings and replicating it to another region. Right? These are all important things that you want to do with your SQL database. So go out, get into the database, create some data, connect with your clients, replicate it over multiple regions, and really get your hands into the SQL database managed service from Microsoft Azure. In this video, I'm going to demonstrate how to configure an Azure database for PostgreSQL. So once we're in our Azure console, we have to get into the PostgreSQL console. So we can come up on the top and go in and view our servers, or we can also click on one of the recent resources down below. So I'm going to go up to the top and I'm going to click View. That should bring me into my console for the Azure database for PostgreSQL servers. So here is where all my databases are. I just need to click the one that I want to configure. You'll see a pop-up come to the right-hand side. I usually collapse the left-hand side to make it a little more visible. And we can see all the resources we set up previously. So the resource group it's in, my subscription, the server name, the admin username, the version, and our performance configuration. So this is what we really want to look at. We can also see our resource utilization, which shows us our CPU percentage and our storage percentage, and it helps us make some really intelligent decisions with regards to sizing our database. When we come down, we can also configure intelligent performance and read replicas. So if we click intelligent performance and we come in, it gives us some query insight. So if there are any long-running queries, if there's any need for indexing and this sort of thing. Now we have no data, so it's not going to really give us any insight, but that is great for like looking at hanging queries, long-running queries, these types of things. So if I come back and scroll back down to read replicas, here's where we can create a read replica. So maybe we want to take some of the reads off of our main database, right, to speed it up a little. So we'll create a read replica. So we have a master here. If we want to create a replica, we just click Add Replica. Enter our server name, so we can call it DB Read Replica Demo. Hopefully it's available globally, which it is. Put my location, right, so I can have it across multiple regions. Do we want to have double encryption? And the pricing tier. So this is the same pricing tier as the master database. So if I click OK, we're submitting a deployment. Deployment is in progress. And when it finishes, I'll get a green check mark box up in the right-hand corner. So coming back into some configuration, we can look at connection security setting. So here's our firewall rules, right, and ACLs. Connection strings are also available, right, for ADO, C++, all the different frameworks. You can get your code with your connection string in it, so that's great. Server parameters are configurable. So once we come into server parameters, we can see all of the database server parameters that we can change, like checkpoint warnings, commit delay, and these type of things. Really database administration. Active Directory administration, right? So we can manage identity and access to our Azure database for PostgreSQL Server. And now pricing tier. So here's where we kind of decide the performance of our database, and really goes hand in hand with pricing tiers. So we've got basic, general purpose, and memory optimize. So we originally clicked general purpose, and you can see that you can't change back to basic after general purpose. You can just increase up to, say, memory optimize. So virtual cores, right? Once we increase our virtual cores, we're obviously giving much more compute power to our database. We're also increasing the estimated monthly cost, right? I just brought it up to 32 vCores from 4, and then we went from $348 to $2,683. But your vCores are essentially your general measurement of performance, right? So it'll have correlation between CPU and memory, right? And really, it's kind of made so that you only have one option to increase and decrease, and it'll proportionally increase and decrease your CPU and your memory and these type of things. You can also increase your storage as well, should you need more storage. And when you're happy with everything, you can come down, double check your monthly cost. Do you want to turn on auto growth storage? Right, we can set our backup periods here. And our redundancy. So should it be locally redundant? Should it be geo-redundant? A couple other properties are really what we just selected when we first set up the database. And then we've got some security configuration that we can look at, like advanced threat protection, private endpoint connections, and so on. But the most of your configuration will take place with the pricing tier, because you may want to scale up or scale down. Replication for creating your read replicas, connection strings, and firewall and connection security type of parameters. So I hope this video showed you how to get into your PostgreSQL database, create some changes, right? Scale up, scale down, create replication, and hopefully it'll help you kind of get a good handle on PostgreSQL and some of the offerings that Microsoft Azure can give you when you're provisioning and configuring this type of data. In this video, I'm going to demonstrate how to configure your newly provisioned MySQL database in Microsoft Azure. So once you're in the Azure portal, you can find a list of services on the top or in the drop down in the top left-hand corner. We're going to come out and click the link for Azure Database for MySQL. Once we click it and we brought into the MySQL server console, you'll see any previous MySQL servers that you've created. So I have one. That was my demo database. So let's go ahead and click the name of the database and do some configuration. So normally I collapse this left-hand side so I can see the full configuration area. You can see some of the essentials. We created these when we provisioned the database. We can now go ahead and change them if we wish, or leave them. So we can change the resource group. We can change our subscription, right? And we can look down and see some of the resource utilization. And we've also got options for intelligent performance and read replicas. So if we go ahead and click intelligent performance, This is an area that will give us some insight on our queries. So long-running queries, any wait statistics. So this may be good if you have database problems or long wait times. You can come in and get some insight. We have no data right now, but if we did and people were running queries, we could get some valuable insight on how these queries are performing. We also, on the left-hand side under settings, can go through all of these settings as well. So let's start with connection security. If I click connection security, you'll see here's where I can deny public network access, add any firewall rules. So if I want to add my current IP, I could just click it and add that to the firewall. Any virtual network rules, any SSL settings, and we can set the minimum TLS version here as well. If we come over and click connection strings, you'll see all the built-in connection strings for different frameworks. So we can copy whatever one that we need to include in our code. We can also configure some server parameters. So these are some configuration parameters for the database and the database server as well. Right, so these are things that you shouldn't really get into unless you really know what you're doing. So there's a lot of stuff here we can change. The percentage of maximum dirty pages, purge batch size, these type of things. So a lot of database administration work. Under replication is where we can create a read replica. Right, so maybe we want to take a lot of the pressure off of our master database. Here's where we can add a replica. So if I click add replica, I can put in a server name. So remember, it has to be globally unique. So MySQL read replica Richard. It's available. I'll leave it in US East 1. So it's still in the region. Same region as our main one. I'm not going to have the infrastructure double encryption. It can sometimes cause some performance issues, so I'm going to leave just the regular encryption on. And the pricing tier matches the pricing tier of the master database. So I can download a template for automation for any subsequent deployments I want to do. I'm going to go ahead and click OK. And now you'll see the deployment is in process. So when it gets done, we'll have a little box come up with a green check mark saying your replica is done and ready to go. So while that's going, I'm going to come up and click Demo MySQL Database and look at a few more configuration settings. So pricing tier. Pricing tier is where we kind of determine the performance of our database. So we've got basic, which is up to 2 virtual cores with variable input-output. We've got general purpose, up to 64 cores with predictable input-output. And then memory optimized gives us up to 32 memory optimized vCores with predictable I/O performance. We're on the general purpose. We can't scale back to basic. We can only go up to memory optimized. So depending on your needs. We can also come down in the general purpose and up our cores. Right, they double. And with that, the price naturally goes up as well. And that vCore is just a representation of computing power, CPU, memory, input, output, these type of things. We can scale up our storage. We can have our storage auto scale for us. We can also configure a backup and how long we want it to back up. Do we want 7 days retention? Right up to 35 days of retention. And our backup redundancy. So locally, we can only recover data loss within the region. For a more disaster recovery approach, you may want geo-redundant, where you can recover from regional outage and spin everything back up in a new region. We also got some security configuration. So advanced threat protection we can turn off or turn on, depending, if we see any harmful attempts to exploit the database. This is what advanced threat protection is for. Any private endpoint connections that we had, we can create here. And we can specify under data encryption whether we want to use a customer managed key or not. We also have some monitoring. So we have metrics like connections, backup storage, memory percent, network in and out. We can create alerts from these metrics to be more proactive in rectifying database issues. And finally, access control. So if we want to configure and fine-tune our access control, right, we can check the access. So view my level of access. We can grant access, right? So we can add role assignments, or we can straight up deny role assignments. If we click on the role assignments tab, if we had any role assignments for the subscriptions, they would be here. Any deny assignments would be here. So what we check here and configure here will show up under the subsequent tabs on the top. So that's a lot of the configuration options for your MySQL database on Microsoft Azure. The only thing we're waiting for now is the replication of our database. So the replication is here. It's unavailable. So if we come up and click our notifications, you'll see that the deployment is still in progress. So it may take up to 7 or 8 minutes. So when that's done, I'll have a fully functioning replica of my database, and that'll take some of the load off my master database. So I hope this video showed you how to get in and fine-tune your database and create the configuration that you need to make your database work exactly how you need for your application and your organization. In this video, I'm going to configure a previously created MariaDB in Microsoft Azure. So up under Azure Services, we can see a lot of our recently accessed portals. So you can click the database for MariaDB, or you can come up under the search bar and type in Maria, and you'll also find it. So I'm going to click Azure Database for MariaDB servers, and it's going to bring me into the console where I can see the previous database that I had created. So if I want to configure this database or fine-tune some features, I can just click the name of the database. Brings me into a little configuration portal. Now normally I collapse the left-hand side, and I can see all the configurations. So here are some of the things that we set up originally that we can change, like the resource group, subscription that it's under. Do we want to enforce SSL? Right, we can see all that here. We've also can control the access. Right, so I can view my level of access. If I just click view my access, right, you'll see that I am a service administrator. I have full access. If we wanted to grant more access to this resource, we can add role assignments here. Once we add those role assignments, we can view their access just like we viewed my level of access. So it's good for checking to make sure that we just do the principle of least privilege. Right? You only give them what they need to do their job. We can also look at connection security settings. So we can deny a public network here. We can allow access to Azure services here. I can add my client IP address to the firewall here as well. Any virtual network rules would go here. Enforcing SSL and enforcing a minimum TLS version. So these are your security settings that are configurable. You can also click connection strings. By copying a connection string for your specific framework, you don't have to write it yourself. It's there for you. You just simply come in and copy and paste. We can also configure some server parameters. A lot of database administration work here. A lot of parameters that you shouldn't play with unless you really know what you're doing. So like the audited logs enabled, the character set server. What's our host cache size? Is the event scheduler on and off? So these are a lot of database server parameters. Replication is interesting. If you want to take the load off your master database, we can create a replica. And we do that here under the configuration. So I click Add Replica. I have to give it a unique name. So I can call it MariaDB Replica Richard and hope that the server name is available, and it is. Give it a location. I could put it in a different region if I want, or leave it in that region. You can see the price change depending on what region you're in. So it's another thing to take note of. I could download a template for automation so I can automate this the next time. I'm going to click OK. And I just submitted my deployment, and now I've got a replica spinning up. So that takes a few minutes. In the meantime, we can come back to our database and look at the pricing tier. So the pricing tier is proportional to your performance, right? So you've got a compute tier, you've got basic, general purpose, and memory optimized. We're at general purpose, so we can't scale back to basic. We can scale up to memory optimized. General purpose is 2 to 64 vCores. Memory optimized is 2 to 32 memory optimized vCores. So if we stay in general purpose, we can increase our vCores. And you can see that that doubles our memory each time we double our vCores. So get an inversely proportional effect on our CPU and our memory as well. If we increase the vCores, we increase our memory and CPU. We can also increase the storage as well. And we can also set our storage to auto scale, so automatically grow as we need it. We've got backup settings. So do we want our backup retention between 7 days and 35 days? Locally redundant. So can we only recover data within the region? Or geo-redundant. If a whole region goes down, can we back up and fire up everything in a new region? Once we're happy with that, we can look at some of the security configuration. So advanced threat protection, we can turn on if someone's trying to exploit our database. We've got private endpoint connection. So if we want to allow connection through a virtual network, we can use a private endpoint here. We'd have to create one. And we also have some monitoring. So we have basic metrics like active connection, CPU percent, right? We can create alerts on these metrics to be more proactive when we're managing our database. We can see things happen quicker and respond to them quicker. So that's some of the configuration that we can do with our Maria database. The only thing we're waiting on now is our replication. So you can see that it's here. It's unavailable, so it's still provisioning. If I come up under notifications, you can see that the deployment is still in progress. And when it succeeds, I'll get a little note up here with a green check mark to say that it has been successful. So again, this sometimes takes 6 to 7 minutes. But when it's done, I'll have a fully functioning replica that I can then help to offload some of the work that my master database is doing. So as you can see now, the deployment has succeeded. My replica is here and is available. So now I've taken a bit of load off the master. So I hope this video showed you how to configure your Maria database and really fine-tune these things like replication and performance and access control and security. So get in, play around with some of these features, and get that database exactly how you need it for your application and your organization. So in this course, we've examined querying techniques for data using SQL language, data definition language, and data manipulation language. We did this by exploring provisioning and configuring relational data services, provisioning and configuring SQL, PostgreSQL, MySQL, and MariaDB databases. In our next course, we'll move on to explore querying techniques for data using SQL language, data definition language, and data manipulation language.